Panel, the government team has deeply mischaracterized who the delta in this debate is. So let me recharacterize it for you. This debate is about situations where the mother wants to have the baby, but the fathers do not, right? Because in a world where both parents don't want to have the baby, then both parents would abort it and they'd be fine with that. And these paper abortions only occur where the father wants to get out of the child's life, where the mother wants to keep the child. So what these paper abortions actually mean is that fathers who it enables the fathers to walk away scotch-free and wipe their hands clean of their child's life, whilst their partner, the mother of their child, who still wants to have the child, is now forced to bear all of the social and economic burdens of raising a child and helping them grow that the gov bench has raised. Now she has to deal with that burden all by herself. They already gave to you, right, that raising a child is a big decision and that it's expensive. So the question we pose is that how is that fair that they shift that burden to just the mother, right? In the world, because if you think about it, principally, it takes two to tango. It takes two to conceive a baby. And if both people consented to that, then, and it's the duty of both partners in the relationship to decide the future of that baby. If one person if the mother wants to have the baby, then the father, it's his decision whether or not to be in their life physically, but it is absolutely imperative that they are forced to have at least some degree of moral and legal culpability in the terms of child support and other financial payments to, I'll take your POIs later, to ensure the child and the mother's life are able to be as good as possible for the harm that they are causing of choosing to walk away from this situation. Okay, so in regards to the points that they raised about having a distant father isn't going to be bad for emotional and economic support, I'll largely rebut these through as I go through my substantive pushes. Now, my first substantive push are in regards to the economic benefits to the mother. And this is in the form of child support payments. And on the op bench, we believe that child support payments are particularly important for children born in difficult circumstances. This looks like children who have been born to low SES parents who are living in low SES areas, and if the mother had to deal with raising the child all by herself, they would have probably have limited access to opportunities like education and limited opportunities to get out of the system of poverty that they are in. Okay, so the bit of framing I want to apply to this is that in our worst case, right, where the father leaves and only has to pay the child support, that is still beneficial for the child and the parents. This is because in the status quo, it is assumed that each household has two sources of income, one from each parent. And child support exists to ensure that that there is monetary support from two sources of income to ensure that there is enough income within the household to be able to pay for costs associated with the child's upbringing. And not allowing paper abortions mean that the father still has the legal responsibility to pay child support and isn't able to weasel their way out of this, leaving the mother to deal with all these economic burdens on their own. Now, why is this important? Well, it enhances the child's ability to be supported and the mother's ability to lead an economically sound life. And as I stated, this is particularly important for children and mothers from low SES backgrounds who are the most vulnerable group in this debate. Yes, it is true that that the interests of the father should be considered, but when you weigh that against the interests and the harms that would otherwise be caused to mothers and children, they are the ones that we should care the most about in this debate. Before I impact this, I'll take a POI.
In status quo, can women abort without the consent of the father?
Yes, they can. However, what we are saying is that even if, in the sense that it is the women's, in society, there is the general consensus that women should have the right to do, have the right to do what they want with their own bodies. in this sense, right, if the woman wants to keep the child, they should not be, they are entitled to do that, but what we are saying is that that doesn't mean that fathers should be able to get out of, like, paying their due support for their involvement in, creating the child that this mother now otherwise wouldn't have wanted to keep in the first place. So in terms of the impacts of the economic benefits to mothers and children, the money that they gain can be used to pay for kids' education, healthcare, and other just costs of upbringing and putting food on the table. This looks like at least some degree of support being given to single mothers who would otherwise have to work tirelessly to love and care for a child that their partner has left them alone with. Okay, now in terms of the social benefits to the child and the mother. And the framing I want to apply here is that this is largely going to apply in situations where the father might have initially been on the fence as to whether or not he wanted to have the child. This could be young students who don't know whether they want to have a child so early. By not allowing, but in principle that these fathers are not entirely against having the child. By not allowing paper abortions, the father either has to come to a consensus with the mother to abort the child, or they have to remain in the child's life because they have that legal responsibility. So for those who are on the fence, this was probably, not having a way out was probably going to be that tipping point for them to be willing to play an active role in that child's life because they weren't, inherently opposed to being there in the first place. So, this inherently results in social benefits for the child and the mother. And this looks like the child having a father figure who he can look up to, who he can interact with, and all those basic day-to-day interactions with family that we otherwise would take for granted. And also, it looks like for the child and the mother, less societal stigma being placed upon them for a situation where they don't have a father. So ultimately, for both these economic and these social benefits to the mother and children, who are the most vulnerable people in this debate, it is absolutely imperative that we do not allow paper abortions to exist. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Leader of the Opposition, and I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
We, as the government, would allow paper abortions. The reasons for this I will discuss are the personal circumstances that increase and are benefited by the people involved, the father, the mother, as well as the child, as well as the political ramifications of allowing paper abortions. To reiterate what the Prime Minister stated as our model, this is only applicable in states where abortion is illegalized. It is fair if the mother has an option to terminate the pregnancy, that option to take away the burden should also be present for the father. So these discussions about the unfair burden on mothers of paying for this child all by themselves isn't really relevant. They have the option not to be a mother. Being a parent is expensive, it's hard, but it also comes with the benefit of being the parent if that is what you want. So for these individuals, these burdens are minimal compared to the joy and the happiness that being a mother and being a parent can bring, because it is a choice they have made. To hammer in on those individual, yes?
What about when it's accidental birth and stuff like that?
Well, accidental births, there's a lot of option there. Do you mean accidental birth as in they didn't know they were pregnant, or the conception? The conception. Yeah. Well, the conception, that's the option there as well. I mean, I know a few people who didn't think they could get pregnant, and they got pregnant, and it was a really big joy for them. They weren't expecting it, but everyone has different circumstances. And as I stated, this is for states where abortion is legal. If this unexpected birth isn't what they want, they have options. They have multiple options. They can abort, they can give the child up for adoption, and these are all hard, but so is paper abortions. You're giving up any privileges, any rights to see this child, as well as the burden of seeing this child. It's a difficult situation in all circumstances, but it is necessary. To move into the specific issues faced by the individuals in this case, to expand on what my Prime Minister said, child support can be alleviated a bit by single mother benefits. I mean, it's not perfect, but that's an issue with single mother benefits that we need to expand. Not that we shouldn't be allowing paper abortions at all. We should just be increasing childcare in the community. Additionally, we're saving mothers from the burden of having to cope with these disinterested fathers, these here again and then not there fathers who, it's a lot harder to deal with the inconsistency than it is to adapt and just overcome being a single parent. Not to mention, these mothers are going to be dealing with children who feel unwanted and uncared for because their father is in and out of the picture, and they're starting to think, oh, maybe it's something I did because he was here until I was 5, but then he left and now he's back again. And it can create all these really terrible, really issues with attachment with the child. There's also the issue of the burden on the father, which is something to consider. A lot of the arguments for abortion apply to the argument for paper abortions. There's this example of dialysis. Should you be forced to be hooked up to a monitor for 18 years or even just 9 months to keep this person alive who is entirely outside of you? I mean, it's lovely if you want to donate blood and all that, but will we force and trap people into doing that? No. And financial and emotional burdens that come with raising a child, they're not maybe as serious or as visceral as the physical pain that pregnancy involves, but they are still serious. It is still a massive burden to be financially and emotionally responsible for a child. It is a lot. It is very difficult. So to move on to the fact that arguments like this, when used for paper abortion, that expand our rights to regular abortion. It's really unfortunate truth that nothing happens in a vacuum. When we legislate, when we include these laws, it means that we will look at similar laws. We'll go, okay, well, how does this affect this? How does that affect that? In America, there was a case recently where this woman had fertilized eggs that were frozen because she was about to undergo a hysterectomy. She had cancer. The court stated that, unfortunately, they had to destroy the eggs when she was divorced because it was shared custody. They just had to destroy it. Because if they didn't treat them as just an object, not fertilized eggs, the only chance of this woman to have a child, it would affect abortion in general. If we don't allow paper abortions, then we're going to start questioning, well, should we allow abortions at all? Are we going to roll back this idea? Because, it is, as I stated, the financial and emotional burden is slightly less, but it is still a burden, and it's still one of these arguments we have for abortion. So by supporting paper abortion, we're giving and increasing the rights to choose if you want to be a parent, choose if you want to undergo this thing. A lot of the same reasoning and logic that we'd have for abortions for the mothers. Any POIs?
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So you said earlier in the speech that instead of that you would increase childcare to deal with the harmful mother. So instead of holding absent fathers accountable, you would rather use taxpayer dollars to increase childcare options. How was this justified?
Well, I'd say that calling them absent fathers, it's kind of harsh because, as we stated, a lot of the time these happens by accident. Maybe you were using protection but it just didn't work, because sometimes that happens. And if we're holding these people accountable for something that they made as a minor mistake, as I said before, it kind of goes to this argument for abortion. Shouldn't we hold mothers accountable and force them to give birth if they make a mistake? There is obviously a difference, but I think, allowing these paper abortions, it's giving people choice if they want to be parents. And as I stated, it's not all burdens having a child. It is lovely. Children are adorable and they're really fun. And if you want to be a parent, you can become a really good parent and you can increase the happiness of both yourself and your child. But if you don't want to be involved, you are only bringing bad things to that equation. You're bringing inconsistency, you're bringing resentment, you're bringing this burden over a child thinking, oh, am I unloved? Am I not worthy? Because their father is being forced to continue contact in the form of, at the very least, sending money, but refuses to visit them. Paper abortions increase both our access and our acceptance of abortions in general, as well as the benefits for individuals. Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you so much to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I now welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to conclude the top half.
It's hard to overstate the impact that having child support it has on a young child and a single mother. The reason paper abortions exist is to allow fathers to get out of the economic consequences of being involved in a baby. We think the harms on babies, as well as the social consequences we mentioned, are so great that they outweigh the moral burden of fairness that opening government attempts to push. We also think that in most situations, there is the practical reality of a father, of an absent father. It is still, whether a father is, different levels of how absent or present a father is, it is still worth forcing that father to make some concessions to the child, particularly economic concessions, and to make particular concessions into being involved in that child's life in most cases. All right. I'll get to rebuttal first, and then I've got sort of two key pushes here. Firstly, I'm going to give you a moral argument about why an unbalanced motion like this, which has a particular higher burden on the father, is a worthwhile thing to do. I'll then talk about the economic impacts and so on. All right, let's talk about a couple of bits of rebuttal. The first key idea we get from opening government is to say that there is danger of an absent father causing particular harms on a child, being trauma harms. But clearly in either world, speaker, there is an absent father, right? In one case, the father is totally absent on the world where there is a paper abortion, or the father is only partially absent. We didn't get mechanisation about why a partially absent father is particularly worse than a totally absent father, especially in comparison to the benefits that we're bringing. We then get the second idea of there being a particular moral burden, which states that it should be, it is unfair to be forced into having a child. So this is what my first key point is, right? At the point, so the context of this debate, I would love a whiteboard to draw it out, is women who want a baby, fathers who do not want a baby, and women who will still go through with that child even if the father has rejected that child. So clearly that woman has decided to become a single mother. Now, because we are in a situation in a country where there is abortion, where we probably do think contraception is pretty widely accepted, it should be accepted at this point that women have a particular right to their body that extends to childbirth. Women have the right to choose to not have a child. We think that given the context of this policy and given the centuries and centuries of oppression of women's bodies and control of women's bodies, we think that women should have a particular right not only to choose not to have a child, but to choose to actively have the child if they can. We think that this is an exclusive we think this is an unbalanced moral benefit that should be applied to women, given the context of patriarchal oppression over time, right? And we also think that in most cases, women have far fewer abilities to have children. So often women might be infertile. They don't have as much of a window to have children. So we think that given the social pressure on women to have children could be very high, we think of the histories of not allowing women to control their bodies as very long. We think that they should have a burden. They have a right to choose to have a child. That is extending and that is effectively oppressive to the father. We also think that at the point that you're going to have a baby as a dad in this country, you probably did have access to contraception. You probably did know the risk of contraception going wrong. You probably did have reasonable expectation that you probably should have had a reasonable discussion. We also think this occurs specifically on more frequently to lower income and more disadvantaged women, right? Women who are less able, who are more likely to be in religious circumstances where they need to have a baby. I'll take to points of 5. All right. So we think there is a moral burden that stands on men in this case. Let's think about the spectrum of fathers in our world. In their world, fathers can choose to be totally absent and cut off support. In our world, fathers are not legally absent, which means they may be almost completely absent in the worst case. However, they will still be sending funding. In a more moderate case, the father will be partially absent. They will be providing social care benefits. They'll be caring for the child occasionally. There'll be a second avenue, which our society, as we mentioned on first, expects there to be. So there'll be some benefits to the child. Now, in this case, the father might actually be a terrible person, right? And we think that this could, in some cases, be somewhat harmful to the child to have an awful father around. But we think that this is outweighed by not having a father, meaning not having any potentiality for a large number of children to get support. We think in the best case on our side, this probably encourages the father who otherwise maybe wouldn't have stayed around to stay around and probably does become a good father. We think this is a clear benefit because being raised a single child has a lot of negative externalities. Sometimes this might be a bad father who stays around. That is obviously a harm, but we think that harm is relatively small in scale compared to not having all of the children in this category not having support. Why is child support so important, and why is this the deciding factor that wins opening opposition to this debate? Because child support is what allows women, especially the vulnerable women who are the main mother character in this debate, to get particular economic aspects that allow their child to have a far greater quality of life. This looks like being able to send them to school with all of their uniforms and books. This looks like being able to have food on the table all the time. This looks like being able to get all of the extracurricular activities that extend a child's opportunities from simply staying in their current social class to extending very high. Now, yes, there will be some rich mothers who decide to who this applies. We think that was probably relatively equal on either side, but we think that most mothers are probably going to be hard up because most single mothers do have problems finding their child because society does expect that. We think that's going to be a thing. I'll take one for closing.
Okay, your principle of fairness, why should you burden fathers when they want to opt out of parenthood? If let me just rephrase, why should fathers be burdened to be parents if they want to opt out, but also be denied parenthood if women choose to raise?
This is what I got to earlier, right? We think that the history of female oppression and the history of patriarchy and the systemic advantages that men have in society gives them that burden. They do deserve to have to sometimes deal with children because they have every other advantage that a woman have been denied over history. We are willing to stand on this ground. Okay, we got to that point. We also got to the economic points. Let's think about the social benefits in the middle ground where we do get fathers who come and attend to some extent. That means that a significant time burden is being taken off the mother. That means that a child probably does have somebody else they can talk to. Even if it's not the best father, it's still somebody else in their life. It's also a legal burden of somebody else who can take responsibility. This means that your life as a young child is not singularly legally determined by your mother or her relations. There is some other pathway. It might be your somewhat distant father, it might be their family. Even though this sounds like a small impact, we think it's a huge impact because the expectation is so strong in society that you have two parents that having one totally absent parent is actually an enormous harm on this child. We're very proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you so much to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and for all speakers in the opening half. I now welcome the Government Member to continue the debate.
Sorry, I'm getting my phone. Yes, I'm so sorry. Okay.
Oh God.
Two things. First, a principled justification on this that is an extension on our opening, and secondly, why this results in better interactions between men and women. So I think what opening government provides you here regarding the principled justification is quite interesting, but not necessarily sufficiently proven, because they tell you that this is a lifelong decision and it's a massive burden on these men and the consequences can be quite high, so they have the right to opt out. The problem is this is applicable at any point after childbirth as well, and so we just don't think they give a reason that sidesteps analysis from OO regarding how this also places such a big undue burden on women, etc., and why we should care about it. So in terms of what we provide is just this principle of reciprocity, that just men deserve to have this right too. Because the explanation from OG is that you can abort in reaction to this info, but they don't explicitly step you out as to why, it is important for men to have this decision in context of a world where first, a woman can abort a child a man actually deeply wants, and that is deeply emotionally damaging to that man. Secondly, can keep a child a man does not want, and in that instance, we think this just is without any of their input and that kind of thing. So at the point where OO wants to run on deontological frameworks of the right to bodily autonomy and things like that, it's unclear why this is exclusive to women. Like, it's not about the patriarchy. You have to apply those frameworks to men too, because deontological frameworks happen to apply to every single person in society. It's like universal rights to bodily autonomy that people have. And so we just think that in terms of like the horror of basically having your genetic material stolen from you, like in that sense, because you did not consent to that child, you did not want that child, and beyond that, you are forced to actually have that child and cater towards it, we think that this is incredibly bad, because, you know, these men just suffer a lot of emotional and psychological turmoil. And we think the only possible recourse for this massive injustice and unjust action towards men, where they can have genetic material of theirs used against their consent all the time, is to allow them to at least opt out and not be bound to that material, because we think that that is what actually allows for full bodily autonomy to occur in this instance. And we also think, regarding the point in the patriarchy, we think that the patriarchy has been incredibly harmful to men too, because it doesn't even allow them self-expression. So they operate on a fallacy that men somehow owe women reparations by literally stripping them of their humanity, not allowing them to make something that is so fundamental to, you know, actually having dignity as a person. We think that that is not right, so they cannot stand on that front. The second thing on principle justification they try to bring us is the utilitarian benefits this has to the child. But the question is, if you support bodily autonomy of the woman when it comes to the child, we just think that we allow for abortions because we decided the fetus does not have the prerequisites to qualify for personhood. And in that instance, the future consequences or the future life that you're stripping them of is inconsequential, because they are not a person. And so the people who are currently existing that actually qualify for personhood are more important in that context. So it may be true that you've stripped them of a life full of really good resources where they can be quite happy or more financially comfortable. But we think that this is not consequential, because in that this is not interesting. I mean, this is not relevant, because future persons simply do not have claim to the lives and the bodily autonomy of current people. And that's why we allow women to actually perform abortions, because we see that even though you're killing all of these future possibilities for this fetus, they are not a person. Similarly, even though you're killing the future financial comfort of this fetus, they are not a person, and the man has the bodily autonomy to actually make that decision. Regarding the weighing against our opening, we just think that the opening explains that an absent father is better than bad parenting, but this is vulnerable to responses from opening regarding how much this child might suffer in the consequences. We give you a principle that it's independent of what quality of life that child has, because we tell you that the father's rights will always actually overcome that. I'll take up here.
In either world, the child still exists at some point in the future. They clearly have a moral burden, and what we're saying is that the autonomy of women does extend over the autonomy of men as a reparatory.
I don't think that the reparations is accurate, considering men literally, commit so much high rates of suicide under the patriarchy, suffer extreme amounts of violence, whether it's through prisons, whether it's through armies and things like that. We think that both men and women are owed justice under the patriarchy, and in that sense, this is a form of actually giving men that form of justice. Secondly, regarding the child, again, unimportant, because we allow ourselves to discount the future of the child in the case of offering that woman autonomy, so we can also discount the future of the child in the case of offering men autonomy. In terms of why this results in better interactions between men and women, we just think that the framing in this is that in status quo, interactions between men and women are quite stilted, and because first of all, there's a growing sphere of men that are antagonistic to anti-men legislation, and abortion policies seem to be viewed as anti-men legislation. For example, the fact that, again, men have no input into this process. The woman can have an abortion regardless of whether you want that baby or not. We think that that is something that men feel is completely unjust towards them, and allows them to be quite antagonistic to the feminist movement. The second thing is that the response tends to be to restrict women's rights in that sphere, because we just think that they have limited creativity in terms of the possible solutions they can think of to actually gain autonomy in this situation, and so they constantly harken back to previous ways that they had that restored level of autonomy in the sphere. Second of all, we just think that bad actors who are anti-women's rights tend to capitalize on this feeling of desperation from men, and they use that to tell them that women should not have access to this right because it strips you of a right. We just think that in the context of us allowing for this to occur, we think that very simple benefit of first making men feel better, because first they're less terrified when they have sexual relationships with a woman because they actually feel like there's a form of justice they have in that sense. They can opt out if something that they did not like happened. And so we think that that just makes their relationships with women better. Secondly, we just think that they're less antagonistic to women opting out of pregnancy because they think they can also opt out of that child's future. And we think that that means that on net, you've lowered the rhetoric on anti-abortion because rhetoric, because a lot of it is genuinely centered on the fact that men do not have a similar right and women are the only ones who have an option in that situation. We think that that makes it, significantly less likely on our side for you to backslide on abortion policies, and know that this is the best benefit that you've been heard in this debate because it fulfills autonomy of every single actor we're discussing on. Weighing this against our OO, because at DPM they say that this increases our acceptance of abortion in general. We just think they don't explain the current antagonistic trends to abortion, why they're happening, and how we precisely solve them through this policy, which we uniquely do. As a consequence of the fact that we give you a more concrete principle justification and just a better world in terms of keeping abortion laws on, never been prouder to propose vote CG.
Thank you very much to the government member for their final remarks, and I now welcome the opposition member to continue the motion carries here.
Oh, that's so weird. Okay. Before I get started, our argument will discuss issues relating to sexual assault, if that's going to make anyone uncomfortable. All right. Everyone ready? Okay, sweet. So, a few things I'm going to do in this debate. First of all, I'm going to talk about how we're going to make a submission about how paper abortions will lead to children not being able to know their biological history and information, and how that will lead to major physical health consequences. Our second submission will be that it disproportionately and unfairly affects children born out of sexual assault as well as victims of sexual assault. And if I have time, I'll go into rebuttals. We'll see. All right, so access to a lack of biological data. Let's talk about the status quo. Presently, the knowledge of diseases that have existed in your genealogical past, your parents, your grandparents, is used by medical professionals to pre-diagnose certain conditions. And through this pre-diagnosis, they can put you up for treatment that may alleviate possible diseases or may completely eliminate them. And that prevents life-threatening things like being able to even just know that you might have a lactose intolerance or some other anaphylactic disease. You are able to know that maybe when the first time I eat this, I shouldn't eat a lot of it, and that can save your life. And we know that this is a problem. It's a common problem for orphans who don't know their genealogical past, and suddenly they're just randomly exposed to, oh yeah, you have a genealogical disposition to die from eating this, right? And that's just thrown on them. That's thrown on the lucky ones. The unlucky ones don't get it thrown on them. They just die, right? So, let's talk about how it's going to be mechanized. If a paper abortion goes ahead, the father has no responsibility, I'll get to it at the end of the argument, has no responsibility to provide their biological details, no responsibility to provide any history of Alzheimer's, particular diseases, predispositions to yada, 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 right? The child and family then grows up without the knowledge of those biological preconditions. That prevents the medical professionals from being able to give those good pre-diagnoses that enable the child and the family to know that this might be a dangerous activity or this is the treatment that might alleviate and prevent that. And as such, they're more exposed to dangerous risks. The yeah, they're more likely to be exposed to these dangerous risks that can either develop into debilitating diseases, cause major inconvenience, or even in the worst cases, die. And under a system without paper abortion, this would be preventable because the father would has a responsibility to provide their biological background. As such, there's just far more preventable diseases and death, and this outweighs everything else in the debate because we're talking about literal human lives that will be lost if this policy goes forward. I'll take that POI now.
Yeah, okay, so firstly, surely genetic testing can be done by a child himself and the father for that. But even if, surely you know who the father is, so if you're aware that things that aren't purely genetic, other medical problems of the father, you probably can still figure this out relying on what's your mechanism where the father not, what's your mechanism that means that you don't, you know your father is not.
Okay, so if you don't know who the father is, there's plenty of circumstances where that can happen. It can happen in cases of sexual assault. It can also just sort of not matter if you knew the father. Certain diseases and disabilities might arise later in life. And there's no way of knowing what that father, if he suddenly departs and leaves no responsibility, there's no way of knowing what diseases he develops or what diseases his parents have. Hey, what if he doesn't even talk about his parents? You can't even know what's going up the next generation up the chain. So I think that makes the point of information sort of pointless. So on to children born out of sexual assault. This was alluded to by opening government, but they didn't really touch on it properly. And I will note that this is what the following argument is going to be allowed by the model presented by opening government. Now, for context, sexual assault is highly common and can lead to pregnancy, of course. And committers of sexual assault, the people who commit the crime, are often known by the individual. And more so, many people who may be pro-choice have an aversion to abortion for personal, moral, or religious reasons, despite of that particular political view. Now, we're going to mechanize this through a hypothetical. Suppose that there is a woman who is sexually assaulted by a known individual. Let's say it's her partner. That's fairly common. As a result of this sexual assault, the woman falls pregnant. This woman, for personal, moral, religious reasons, what have you, does not want an abortion and does not want an abortion. The assaulter, aware of this, and does not want to raise or look out for the child or provide any financial backing, gets a paper abortion prior to the birth of the child, which would, of course, be very likely impossible if the assaultee and assaulter were in a relationship. If this happens, the assaulter likely suffers no consequences for their misconduct. Unless they're prosecuted, which we all know rarely happens, right? And even on that, the mother ends up with the sole burden of a child that she had no wish of having, right? And opening government alluded to this idea of when you consent to an activity, there's this subtle, we might have a child, but that's irrelevant in a sexual assault case. Sorry I didn't take a POIs. The impact of this, it's an extremely unjust outcome, right? The person who is forced to have a child is punished. They are not given the support that they need for having this child that they did not want. And the child is brought into a world that no one really wanted them to come into. And there's no one to look out for them in that adjustment period. And this is really impactful because it's like opening government sort of alluded to, it's directly impacting people who are discriminated against and marginalized, but this is direct. It's not a result of historical oppression or anything like that. This is absolutely a direct consequence. On to rebuttals. For OG, we think we just completely beat them on weighting. And also they claim that everyone has the right to not do it. In cases of sex, everyone has the right not to be a parent. In cases of sexual assault, not relevant, right? Because they probably should have the right. And CG, I ran out of time, so I'll leave that to whip. Proud to oppose.
Thank you so much to the opposition member, and I now welcome the government whip to conclude the government bench. Here you go.
Three things in this speech. Firstly, the principle. Secondly, the outcome. And lastly, the impact. But before then, let's take closing opposition out. Closing opposition is like two pushes here. Firstly, they say children are not able to know their biological information because, like, obviously, the father is going to be absent to provide like, that kind of information. Two responses here. Firstly, we think generally, like, this kind of information is not really accessible to most individuals. Most people don't know, like, their genetic makeup. But even if, like, let's check them in their baseline and say it's true that fathers might know, we think it's easier as well, like, for the mother to just, like, if you see your child has got issues, you can just go and have, like, screening tests, those kind of things. We are not going to know, like, that kind of information. We're not really sure why you can only access that kind of historical information only when your father tells you that I have Alzheimer's, when you can just, like, go to the hospital and have that test done to you. Secondly, their push was an idea of, like, sexual assault. The mechanism here, we do believe that's true, that in some instances there's existence of sexual assault, which probably, like, would lead to the harm, especially, like, for religious individuals because they don't abort the child. We think that's true. But the mechanism that they try to provide, they don't show why, one, the person that assaulted you is like going to provide like that kind of support. Because if you assault someone, you go to jail. So we don't think you still have that mechanism to support the person. But secondly, from closing government, we're very happy to deny someone that assaults you sexually that kind of right to opt out. Because one, there was no mutual consent to have the child in the very first place or to have like the kind of sexual intercourse in the very first place. So the consequence of that then, it means we're very happy to have the person that assaults you to pay those damages. We're very happy to protect the child if you don't want to abort the child because of religious beliefs when you have been assaulted. That mechanism, they need to defend why that is likely going to happen on that side. Okay, in clashes then, principle. What do we hear from opening government? Opening government argues the principle about like saying, firstly, parenting is long term, so because of that, let's give people the right to opt out because of like the kind of trauma that happens in the round. Our extension in terms of principle was simple. We say, if we don't give you bodily autonomy and the consent to the child, they have stolen your genetic material, and that is something that we're very happy to defend. We think that kind of protection of the genetic material in terms of principle is something that is just and we're willing to defend. What we hear from opening opposition and why is our extension and principle debate winning? Opening opposition argues the ideas of fairness. Two mechanisms that they try to give you. First, they say, oh, there's like mutual consent to sex, and therefore it means you need to take care of the child together. But the second, they say women have a right to do whatever they want with their own body because of like the historical injustices in order of itself. We ask them through a POI and say, why should we burden men, particularly to become fathers if they don't want to become fathers, or why should we then deny men fatherhood if women want to keep the baby, if women want to abort the child? They say women have been historically disenfranchised and therefore that should be a right. We told you in our extension that you harm women in that kind of situation. How is this true? Because it means you worsen the kinds of interactions between men and women. It means you're increasing things like anti-abortion rhetoric. We have seen this with America overturning like the Roe v. Wade, because men will say, because women have this right, we can't opt out. We think in a situation like there's paper abortion, it means you have more men having like pro-abortion, like pushing for pro-abortion laws and supporting women. We think at that moment they're able to then have that kind of compensation which opening opposition wants for women. Comparatively, you can't have that because in those states where abortion is legal, there are people that push the anti-rhetoric against abortion. It means you can change those laws and you harm women on that kind of idea. In principle, closing government wins because we think human dignity can only exist because of your ability to consent and maintain your genetic material. We win. Closing opposition didn't have a contribution on the principle. Before the outcome.
Yeah. Is it justified to also let the men who use women for their bodies and perpetuate the harms they face under the patriarchy to exploit these paper abortion systems?
We don't understand what you mean by men that use women for their own, that use women in that situation. At best, maybe the understanding will be like men that probably want to have sex with a lady and then just throw away and just say, oh, sure, I'm going to opt out of that mechanism. Yeah, we don't think this is likely going to happen the way in which they're framed. Why is this true? We think the moment you have paper abortions, it means one, women are able to be very careful with the men that they interact with. If you know that this person probably is a player, you are probably not going to have the kind of relation, probably where they come from and that kind of background. We think we have the kind of ability to claim that that's true or don't think that it's likely going to happen either way. But secondly, our principle is still outweighing that anyways. Secondly, on outcome, what do we hear? Opening government says, yeah, these people become bad fathers because they don't want fatherhood. In that kind of situation. They don't really explain why they become like bad fathers in and of itself. Our outcome really was very basic, which was linked to our principle about like why that kind of like increased conversation and like can make like laws better. Net benefit, we're very happy and we can solve the issue of patriarchy. Opening opposition's push here was the economic burden. To say, oftentimes there's things like child support and men need to provide that kind of child support. Opening government's response at best was to say, yeah, but the only existence is like you can provide the child support, but the child probably doesn't really know the father. Our extension is very simple in terms of like rebuttal. Please note panel. We say you increase hatred between like the Western relationship and increase hatred between like the child, mother, and the father. Why is this true? Because if you can only provide financial support to the child, sure, you are partially present, but it means the child hates you and this harms them in terms of like the ability to grow and function very well. It harms their own mental health. Comparatively, we think it's easier for women to say, your father died when you were born. I think that way you protect the child's mental health and their ability to grow because they know that my father doesn't really exist. The difference is you can provide the money, but children oftentimes don't really need the money for their emotional support. They need a kind of love. We didn't really understand why money is something that is like really important, given that already there are mechanisms that support people from like low SES communities, mostly in with like welfare support systems and all kind of things. We think that mechanism is like going to happen. But from closing, we are really happy as well to extend to say, in most instances, if you keep the child, oftentimes like it means like you can have like extended family support and those kind of things. You still have those mechanisms and the people surround you to support you in terms of like building like the child. We think that at that moment, in terms of like the actual impact from closing government, we're happy to protect the child, we're happy to protect the women. Because when you have the side in which opposition is trying to defend, what do you have? You give women the hope that the father is going to be providing for the child. It means in instances where the father is not able, because their mechanism of like support is only dependent if the father is able to support a child in and of itself. Oftentimes people opt out because they can't provide like that kind of support. Panel, we're very proud to support.
Thank you so much to the opposition, the government whip, and I now welcome the opposition whip to close that out debate. Yeah.
I'll apologise to everyone in advance that I'm doing this speech with my sunglasses on. My normal seeing glasses just broke and I can't see without them, so it'll have to.
Oh, that's about the lens.
Yeah, the frames just like come undone. Okay, a few things I'm going to do in this speech. Firstly, just like rebuilding our extensions and as to like responding to the world set up by government and why like even if we do abide by like their rule and whatever, our extensions still stand and are the most important parts of this debate. Secondly, just like even more thorough rebuttal to opening government, and then thirdly to government, and fourthly waiting as to why we beat out opening. Okay, so firstly is to just like I suppose general framing and response to like the world set up by government. So basically the world set up by government is like this whole world where like women are the only one who like get the say towards abortion, stuff like that. This only happens with abortion, stuff like that. Obviously like I'm not going to go into like politics about abortion and stuff like that. I'm too tired for that. But realistically we think like even if that, you know, does happen and stuff like that, we think that our extension still stands with regards to like where cases where like abortion is allowed and stuff like that but isn't optimized. Things like people not taking upon the opportunities to use abortions for like societal pressures, family pressures, religious pressures, etc. But also like more importantly, just like sexual assault and like cases of stuff like that, which are like, you know, not right now. Basically like the same reasons why like probably the government is probably being like super supportive of like pro-choice and stuff like that. So if like sexual assault does occur, then like, you know, they can just get an abortion and stuff like that. But we think where cases of and scenarios where like this doesn't happen, where the person doesn't want to get an abortion for a number of like societal pressures and reasons for things like religion, stuff like that. Also just the idea that like in society in general, there are still like very mixed views and it's very like contentious about abortion, stuff like that. And so it's likely that people will be swayed in some extent to be like, oh, well, like people are going to think of me like really negatively. And that's probably going to be something that's like really persuasive to someone and like perhaps talk them out of wanting to actually get an abortion, stuff like that. And so we think that in those cases where the woman is like, you know, forced to keep the child, we think that is like particularly harmful for the man or whoever, if it is like, I'll first address like cases of sexual assault and stuff like that. So we think that like, yes, they should obviously get punished for that if it was a case of like something like non-consensual sex which resulted in a child, then obviously that's like really, really bad and whoever the perpetrator should get punished. And part of that should be probably them like providing for the child in some extent. Obviously they're not going to want to be in their life, but we think that like part of their punishment should actually just be like, you know, still paying like child support and stuff like that. So they are still like making some kind of amendment to, you know, they like really stuffed up. But also just on the point of like, even if that doesn't happen, we think that like, you know, if the woman is stuck with the baby, then the man should probably like have some level of obligation where they have to support the mother, because like even if the mother doesn't want it and stuff like that, then like they're going to be alone in the situation where they're not going to want the child, but the father will have to, you know, probably has some level of like moral obligation to want to, not to want, but to need to like support that family. Okay, so secondly, again, just like on like 4 reasons why that might happen: personal reasons, pressures from families, religion, just like society in general. But I would secondly just like to rebuild our other extension as to like, knowledge of like family, like DNA and diseases and history and stuff like that, and just like really re-mechanize this. So the idea was basically here that like, you know, we're taking the assumption, I suppose, that like, if this would involve where like the father doesn't have like any rights or any like responsibility or anything like that towards the child, then that will probably look like them not having that much of an obligation to have to share like their DNA and stuff, and for them to actually like know much about the parent, I suppose. And so that would result in like, you know, lots of things that could be like potentially concerning regarding their like lineage, regarding their like DNA and like potential diseases that are really, really harmful, as our member has spoken about. We basically got rebuttal from closing government about like, oh, well, like, wouldn't you just get a test and stuff like that? We just think that's like absolutely ridiculous, when like chances are, if you've got a disease, then it's not like everyone's just like, well, I'm just gonna get a like test for some like random ass disease that who knows, you very well might have because you don't know who your father is or something like that. Okay. Moving on to just like other rebuttals. So we basically hear from like opening government a few things. So firstly, that it would just like result in like better outcomes for the child when like basically giving like a number of reasons for this and stuff like that, including that there's just like no time wasted over like parents fighting for custody and stuff like that. Secondly, that it would just be like motherhood will be like overwhelmingly just like responding to that first one about like better outcomes for the child, we just don't see how like that really matters or like makes any sense at all. Basically on our side of the house, we see it as just like super important that like there would still be some contribution towards the child's life is better than none, regardless of what it is. Even if the father like isn't actually in their life, but even if they're still paying child support, we still think that is like a massive, massive addition to the life and benefit, rather than just like, you know, not having anything to do with the child's life. As mentioned by our opening, it's basically just like the importance of like child support and stuff like that, how it basically just like opens so many more opportunities towards their life and their livelihood, stuff like that. And so I basically just like don't need to reiterate, but that just like most of opening government didn't really matter. in that respect in the debate. But secondly, where's it gone? Oh no. Okay, yeah. And so secondly, like open government's point basically, closing government's point about just like how this will result in like, contention about like what the moral obligation and how this will be like more harmful for the father, I suppose. And we think that just like, surely the father should, if they can have like a right or whatever if we're playing in the world where blah, 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 about pro-choice and like if abortions are available. Sorry, it's like all terms, I'm getting confused now. Yeah, but we think that like we would happily take that trade-off of in terms of like all the benefits which our team has outlined to like on our side of the house in terms of just like actually contributing why the child's life and their development is absolutely crucial to this debate. It's the most important part of this debate, and why having like even just the smallest benefit is just like better than none as proposed by opposition. And we think that like wins the debate for our team. Proud to propose.
Thank you so much to all speakers. I do invite you to clap or shake hands, say well done. All that, I'll ask you to step out and we'll call you back